Very much, and welcome, and thanks to Foster's for again hosting this event. There are a lot of downsides, of course, to the whole education agenda, not least of which pressures on students from uplifted tuition fees. So it's a huge pleasure actually to be able to deal with some of the great positives, and we have in our folio in education some really remarkable scholarships, and the Foster Travelling Scholarship is certainly one of them. And it's been running since 2007, and it was created very much in the spirit of Lord Foster's own experience as a student of architecture. Now, if you think about the aspect of travelling in enriching the student of architecture's understanding of the subject, actually you're dealing with an incredible historical continuum. You can include in amongst that experience that Lord Foster had Piranesi, Corbusier, Kahn. Certainly as a student of architecture, I was leafing through Kahn's sketchbooks from the Greek islands, from among other places, and you can see in those early sketches the provenance for much of the later work, the interest in mass, the interest in a kind of rather visceral, almost primeval geometry and form. So there's absolutely no doubt that the experience of travel, it's not just about coining the cliches about broadening the mind, it's actually about informing the discipline, it's about contributing to the professional person. And thanks to the generosity and support of Lord Foster and Partners, the scholarship's now supported 7 students from the University of Bath, from Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, from Rizvi College of Architecture in Mumbai, the Scott Sutherland School of Architecture at the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, the Universidad del Biobío in Chile, and the Bartlett University College of London. So all the howls of anguish from both schools of architecture and the profession about the RIBA only being interested in London centricity are well and truly confounded by the fabulously international nature of the winners of this particular scholarship. This is properly international. Thomas Aquilina completed his part 1 at Isala. Isala sounds rather like something bacterial, but of course it is the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And he's been known to us, in fact, for a little while, because he's been a student writer of the RIBA student newsletter for the last couple of years, and we're really delighted to welcome him tonight as the 2012 recipient of the RIBA Norman Foster Travelling Scholarship. And he received the scholarship in 2012 for a project entitled Material Economies, Recycling Practices in Informal Settlements along African Longitude 30 degrees east. This is about addressing recycling in informal African settlements. And rather than looking at informality in settlement as a problem, Thomas aimed to look at it as being entirely inspirational, that the informality could achieve efficient entrepreneurial practices of recycling. So the project aims to explore and learn from the material economies of the African city. And for those of us as old as myself who were brought up on the idea of elegant cities composed by people like Haussmann and Nash and, God help us, Albert Speer, the fact is that the informal city is in fact going to become the standard for all cities above 25 million people in the next 25 years. 50% of world settlement in the next 2 decades is likely to be informal, unlicensed, built without the standard consents that we're so used to in Western European architectural practice. So to emphasize the criticality of accepting and understanding the informal city as an alternative model is a real achievement. It's not something which in architecture and in architect practice we readily do. We're visual hygienists, we're constantly trying to tidy things up. So Thomas's great achievement with this project is accepting the informality as something which can be learnt from and developed. The presentation, Material Economies, Critical Reflections, Informal Recycling in 6 popular African cities, gives us an overview of his research and travel experiences. My view is that the best students never shrink from asking the biggest questions, and Thomas Aquilina is no exception. Thomas.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. And good evening, everyone. Undergraduate critiques cannot prepare you for this kind of audience. It is indeed a rare privilege to be here and to speak to you today. I am grateful to Lord Foster and all members of the judging panel, of whom Sarah Ichjoka is here today. I also want to thank Sarah Simpkin and Katie Harris from Foster and Partners, Haley Russell and Jean-Paul Nunez from the RIBA for their continued support. As well, I have some familiar faces in the audience. Thank you, and thank you all very much. Architecture, as my first year tutor told me, is everywhere, but not everyone notices. Since then, I've been motivated by an everyday experience of architecture that finds extraordinary moments in the city. Buildings can sometimes produce these sorts of moments. 2 years ago, I traveled to Nairobi. I was there working for the United Nations. I was at UN Habitat, based at their headquarters. And traveling to the African continent then broadened my perspective on the role of architecture in everyday life. In Nairobi, those moments may be less visible, especially in settlements usually termed slums. Where buildings are informal, it is the use and experience of a space that is just as extraordinary. I cannot be as interested in the design and built form as in the very people who inhabit these spaces. This experience, together with other visits to Africa, had encouraged me to apply for the RIBA Norman Foster Travelling Scholarship, which, as you know, is awarded to one student to a location and a topic of their choice. My winning proposal was to travel along a longitude 30 degrees east, through Africa to look at recycled materials. And I've just returned from this long trip across 6 cities, spending 6 months. I went to Cairo, Addis Ababa, Kampala, Kigali, Lusaka, and Johannesburg. And for the next few minutes, I will share with you my original intent, some research methods, and some insights from the field. We will journey to these places, encounter their people, and discover some peculiar material things. I want us to see these photographs as perhaps powerful subjects, but I want us to look at what happens in the background of these photographs, in the background of these cities. Now, this photograph was taken 4 years ago, whilst I was in Rwanda with university colleagues. We were working on a grassroots project. And when we walked through the city, through the capital city of Kigali, locals would see us and they would shout out to us, "Hey, Mzungu," which translates from Swahili to mean white person. But when the locals would catch sight of me, they'd hesitate for a moment. And they'd say, "Hey, Obama." This would happen almost every day back then. But on this most recent journey, I was referred to the president only a handful of times. This anecdote refers to the title of this talk, Recycling in the Popular African City. This is a journey about what's prevalent in cities such as Kampala and Kigali. Not necessarily popular as we may imagine it, the popularity of a president, but popular in a different kind of sense. In this African city, perhaps Perhaps popular suggests where people actually are and live. And so perhaps popular can be an alternative to the term slum. Originally, my journey was defined by that precise line that would give me reason for stopping in certain cities and chart essentially a long section across the continent. I expected the physical locations and layouts to be significantly different. And in turn, I thought the materials would change and be adopted and reappropriated along this line. I also expected to find materials that were implausible, the vernacular materials and the ways of recycling that could almost be unimaginable. Now, whilst I remained on this vertical line, the materials were anything but outrageous. They were ordinary. It was not about the aesthetics of materials, but about how these things are transforming everyday life and producing specific moments of organization. The scale of the continent may have anchored my project, but diversions on the ground and local experiences were all the more productive. These were at a micro and nano scale. The travel itself was intended to be 12 weeks, spending 2 weeks in each city. In the end, I was there for 6 months. At first, I prepared a meticulous scenario for each destination. I even started to have an Excel spreadsheet for people and organizations and settlements that I would visit. But I quickly realized that actually I should arrive and carry no preemptive ideas, that I could find my way by chance encounters and engagements with people on the ground. This offered me a much more angled perspective and an intimate understanding of their place. My spreadsheet remains incomplete, but this journey became much more than that line. I traveled consciously, keeping in mind the attitudes that served me well as an undergraduate, persistence and curiosity. I learnt to go with the flow, moving as I could as the popular economies exchanged and transferred, sometimes surfacing at the local crowded market, or the city square, or the local footbridge, or the curbside barbershop. I travelled to the popular quarters, often on the edges of the city, built of incomplete and fragile structures. These buildings became merely the background for people to organize and arrange their everyday activities and scenarios. People were involved in all kinds of economies that claimed and negotiated space. Established structures and their respective functions were outstripped by another kind of operating, another kind of using the city. I traveled by following the life of a material in each city, which took different turns and different directions, and each of these materials were in some way recycled, specific to their location, and part of an informal livelihood. The city market and the city square were seemingly at the center of most operations. Mobile economies proliferated, whether they were cellular money transfers or vendors on the front line in Tahrir Square. In Cairo, the found material was the precious copper elements on circuit boards in discarded smartphones. The value of the object shifted according to where it was in the city. Whilst I was there, phones were being assembled, gathered, and dismantled. Since I left, the metal has been sold again. In Addis Ababa, a ubiquitous construction site fence that is erected as a directive from the government and always painted in this yellow and green pattern. This fence is already becoming an appropriate popular roof material in the city. And in Kampala, a vendor's chart box, refashioned out of old cardboard packaging. The chart, once packaged motorcycles, and it now serves as a selling tray. In Kigali, where plastic carrier bags are outlawed, people are remaking paper envelopes from throwaway things, such as cement bags. In Lusaka, a hybrid wheelbarrow assembled from an old car tire and an old oil drum as the dish. This makes an inexpensive luggage transport in the city. In Johannesburg, an iron and board frame that is used as the stand and steering device for vendor operations. People use this ambiguous space between private and public, unofficial and official, to find work. And the example of the chart box in Kampala perhaps best encapsulates my project. I've just finished a film. Cool. What's this called?
Chat. What is the word? Chat.
We call in Uganda chat.
Chart. Hey, what's that mean?
Katimba against you,
Charger, headphone, the charger, 3,000.
Look up for 2,000, 2,500.
How big is your chart box?
This one of 4 inches. The same 4 inches, 4 inches.
I'm a vendor.
Vendor.
Yeah.
Nice. How many years have you been here?
Here,
Yeah.
like 4 years.
4 years.
Yes.
And before?
I went schooling.
Now this stage I'm already here.
And 10 years ago, where were you 10 years ago?
There, in front there. I was there, front there, sitting down there.
And the KCCA, did they trouble you?
Chart badi kupoteza. Natola mbili.
They leave you with the chart and they take everything inside.
Ah, everything. How much? Come on, how much? I'll buy this one. I'll buy this one. I'll buy this one. I filmed this with 2 filmmakers from Uganda. And whilst filming in the taxi park, a vendor came up to us called Richard. And he said to me, this chart you see here has given me 4 wives and 6 children. This minute scale operation gave Richard a means to participate with the city, albeit modestly. I'm interested in the resilience of urban residency in Africa, and with it, the possibility. Working in unfamiliar environments is challenging, but my field methods were straightforward. Interviews with local people, street photographs, and the distribution of disposable cameras to residents. I carried these cameras with me in my rucksack everywhere I went. And when good rapport with a resident was established, I would ask politely if they could take some photographs of their everyday journey in the city. First, I used this method to get a foothold in the city and to locate potential recycled materials. And this would include the people I encountered almost immediately, taxi drivers, shoemakers. In the second example, It was to probe further into this select object, finding out where it came from and where it was going. And the people here were always part of this material network. For example, taxi driver Adane in Addis Ababa, who drove this immaculately kept Russian Lada taxi. Adane shot a typical drive through the city. And here he captured this green and yellow fence. His journey was located between the old town and the new town. But his photographs, like all other disposables that came back to me, provided a clue for my project. I would examine the photographs with the resident, and we'd usually find an object or material somewhere in the background of these images. In Lusaka, this vendor, James, was selling headsets outside the city market. He accepted the camera without hesitation. But a couple of hours later, I received a text message from James. It read, "Thomas, what's your mission?" So I responded, "Well, James, I'm just a student doing some research. Your photographs will help my project." His reply, "I thought you were a spy. Welcome to Zambia." I met all kinds of people. This is one of James's photographs. And it shows here on the left-hand side, the sort of wheelbarrow that was across the city, always downtown in Lusaka. This improvised handcart recycles a heavyweight car tire and this oil drum to make the body, and is a useful service to move between taxi park and market. The cab tends to transport charcoal, groceries, and mattresses, and is locally known as Zam Cab. I've seen in these cities the habitat of dealing with difficult things. I've seen in these cities the capacity to survive for people like Adane, Richard, and James is often based on a saturated life. I've seen in these cities people contribute, divide the spoils, quick to fill in and substitute, and make up for established relations. Life is grounded. It often takes place on the street, where conversations and networks can be shared. The informal dimension of these cities is the popular architecture. Whilst no space can be liberating, it offers a place where active participants can gain momentum for the public to see. For example, in Tahrir Square. Now, this scholarship has provided me with an informal education, complementary to my undergraduate degree, and will be very informative for the next part of my training. It has allowed me to step into an unknown territory and take a risk into a new field. The scholarship, now in its 7th edition, has traveled to different places, different continents and different cities, but shows a world often connected. And I believe almost fundamentally that these places and these cities are important and a critical subject, not necessarily as a process of accelerated urbanization, but because they offer a radically different way of being. Since traveling, it has become clear to me that these cities are going somewhere, but they are also always on the point of turning into something else. I learned that life can be about the tiny things and small victories. I learned how to negotiate hazardous traffic, to negotiate political demonstrations, to negotiate fast-talking street hustlers. I learned to haggle resolutely over the price of everything, always asserting that my old presidential appearance should warrant me a credible African price. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Questions? Thomas, this was absolutely stunning. I remember one of my old degree tutors, who was one of the old art program law, when berating students who hadn't actually produced anything, he said, all you've given us is the soundtrack and I want to see the movie. Well, we got soundtrack and movie here, and actually I didn't know whether to listen or to look or both. It's extraordinary. First of all, your prose is absolutely exquisite. It's got a character which keeps you on the edge of your seat waiting for the next word. Beautifully composed, really. It's easy, I think, to romanticise the very, very toughness of the lives that are being lived here, and the saturation of colour that the sun gracefully and freely provides in every shot that you've taken, which I think is something else. But it brings home all the messages, I think, about waste in the West. I think it brings home the fact that actually we have lost a technical imagination somehow that allows us to improvise solutions from, frankly, very often next to nothing, which we saw time and time again in all the people that you've met. They had stunning solutions which were technically perfect, and which were recycling an element of something in ways that are unimaginable. I think we've lost that capability in some ways. So there are so many object lessons here, but let's take some questions from the floor.
I do have a question. First of all, I thought it was absolutely stunning as well, and what I'm about to ask you is because it's not a criticism, I'm interested to know if you can push your argument even further, is that I was left wondering, this is a culture that's much poorer than the culture we live in, and they don't have a role for an architect, they are self-architects. Mm-hmm. And so it's very inspiring what they're doing, but if we always are taking 15 steps back to a place where we're not now, where is the role of an architect then in that? Or do you think that the role of the architect itself is something that's going to become more intrinsic to us all? And is it going to be perhaps the great, what we used to call the great white hope of the artist, you know, and perhaps we're all a bit more artistic than we used to be when we used to have these 15 people that could exhibit at the Royal Academy? Or perhaps we're not going to have these 15 architects who are at the top of the great Western canon of architecture. Perhaps that's what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah.
It's a very big question.
A very big question. I think there's a place for architects here, and throughout my travels I collaborated often with the universities in these cities. And so I spent a lot of time with architecture students and architecture academics in these African cities and institutions. And I would ask almost the same question. And most of the time, the kind of answers I had back were, yes, there's a place for us, but it's a very different place to the kinds of architects that they even spend their time researching and looking into, which is the same architects that I did whilst as an undergraduate. And so there's a shift in role there. And I think you're right, there's a more active, that people will play a more active participatory role in designing their own city. And these are some examples where perhaps these moments of almost creativity show faint possibilities and unplanned openings that kind of design the city in some way. But I don't think there will be this same, I mean, at least not here, in these 6 examples. The role of the architect as we know it will be perhaps very productive. And I think there needs to be some kind of engagement. And I found when I was working at the United Nations 2 years ago, I was very detached. And I wonder if that detachment almost is reminiscent of the architect, this almost view from above. Whereas perhaps this kind of travel, which wanted to radically explode this romantic image that we have, is that if you're on the ground and from below, perhaps then you can begin to realize the kinds of moments of organization, moments of agency that these people have, and then you can learn from that, and I think then take that into your architecture. Unfortunately, the architecture at the moment in a lot of these places is only trying to make an effort to replicate what they see in Europe and America. So if anything, there's an even greater divide and discrepancy. I don't know, does that answer your question?
It's brilliantly answered, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello.
My question is not really sophisticated or anything. I'm just wondering, what was your favorite example of recycling that you see?
Okay. So my favorite would be the Zam cab, which was that hybrid wheelbarrow that we saw in Lusaka in Zambia. I partly liked the name, Zam cab. I thought it was brilliant and very local. It was all assembled. It was kind of the perfect example that you had it all assembled from recycled car tires, from recycled oil drums. The rods would be found randomly in the city to make the held parts, handles, thanks. And thanks, Pa. And but whilst that was such a good example, I thought in Addis Ababa it was much more subtle, although obvious, because the entire city now is green and yellow. Every open space across Addis Ababa is covered in these green and yellow fences. And you'd almost not you would almost just they wouldn't even catch your attention. But when I would see all these photographs always showing green and yellow, and when the resident would take a photograph of their siblings, yet there's a green and yellow backdrop, or when they're photographing the new construction site, and at the bottom you have this sort of small line, again colored in green and yellow. I got quite interested in that. And so that became, I suppose, a lot more speculative, because as well, it's not as obviously recycled. It's something that perhaps will be reused quite significantly. So those two examples, I think Addis Ababa with this fence, and then Lusaka with this Zam cab. And so what I was really interested in Addis Ababa was that this fence almost gave, and by the way, Paolo, who's here, I collaborated with Paolo in Addis Ababa, who's a photographer, and it's great to have him here because he journeyed with me. And we found that this fence was, in a way, demarcating the popular areas. And there's a current drive from the government to shift these popular spaces to the edge of the city, where you have newly built condominiums that are supposedly that kind of architecture that will house these residents. And so you could almost draw out where people used to live, or where people once were, these popular areas, downtown in the city, because this fence sort of marks it out. And so we then go to the condominiums, and where people always talk about we have more space, we have good sanitation, that's useful in some ways. But when we really probed and got into some of the finer details, we found that actually the mobile network on the edge of the city wasn't working. So where people were previously brokers and always agents, they couldn't continue that kind of realm of work. They had lost their social network, which, as I mentioned before, was always grounded. And here they were living in a 8-story condominium block. And so for them to climb this staircase was incredibly different, and it became quite fractious in the city. And so this fence, I thought, was quite unique, and especially because it sort of it wasn't as obvious as perhaps the Zam cab. Thanks.
Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
I was curious to know what, after 6 months and having the time to absorb it, what new questions it's raised in your mind that you would like to pursue in your future studies and work?
So I'd like to think about how this could be a design project. I think there is material here that can be transferred across into some kind of drawn design, and I don't know what scale that is at, but that's the sort of question I'm asking now. Initially I was interested in that much larger scale, the continental scale, but then when in the city I would sort of draw into the nano details. So the detail of perhaps in Kigali, where, as I mentioned, the plastic bags are completely outlawed. And so everyone has to use paper bags to carry their stuff. And so there's a real detail to that, because what do people use to make or refashion this material? So scale is quite interesting to me. And how can that be thought through a design project? So that's one thing I'm really interested in. I have a bit of time now because I've been invited to present at Archi Africa, which is a conference in Lagos in December. So I'll try to use this time now to think about these questions. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you.
So you've gone through all these cities and you've walked through them. Did you find a similarity in the formation of the town squares when you went from one city to the other? Mm-hmm. And then when you came back to England, were you able to make any comparisons between the places that you've been and London?
Well, to compare the 6 cities initially, I thought I found that the first and the last, so Cairo and Johannesburg, not necessarily because of their extreme locations in my travel, but those two were quite similar. And I felt perhaps there was, in those two places, there were quite a lot of urban space, open space for people to gather, or at least people gathered in these spaces. So Tahrir Square is an obvious example. But then the 4 cities in between had almost no open space, no public space. And I found that quite different, very different in fact. And I wondered if we take it as such a luxury here in our London or European setting, that we have this open space and we can appropriate it and participate in our own ways. I thought in these 4 places where this wasn't really available to those residents, that there's something's missed there. But then it also reflects how these people interact with each other. It's much more about a shared network amongst people. So the conversations that people have is a lot more disclosed and closed rather, as opposed to open. And so maybe that speaks of why open space isn't as prevalent across these 4 places. So I found that Johannesburg and Cairo were in some way similar to London, whereas the other 4 were very different. And I also spent a lot more time in those 4 because I found it difficult to work into those places as a comparison to the first and the last.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you actually make a really interesting point about this loss of agency, that if you take people out of these hyper-dense communities, which are actually very demanding to live in one way, and put them in 8-story condominium with perfect sanitation and so on, that loss of agency issue is actually a political question, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the big cities in China are going through this process now. You know, you drive out of Shanghai in the morning and an entire Hutong neighborhood has disappeared during the afternoon, the same in Beijing and all over. And you know, the miracle provides sanitation and structural stability in 20 floors or 30 floors or whatever, but actually that togetherness of people is eroded. And I think it's I think there's an interesting secondary question here about, you know, to what extent is resettlement on that kind of scale a political question as well. You know, the emptying of that neighbourhood of 250,000 people at the base of the citadel in Cairo is a very interesting thing. You know, is that part of the ignition process what's happening in Cairo today? I don't know, because when that neighbourhood, which was, yes, overcrowded, hugely insanitary, but super vibrant and massively historic, when that went, somehow the ferments come out somewhere else. I don't know. It's just it's a really interesting question.
I mean, you see that pattern in Western cities as well, completely looking at slum clearance and resettlement in the modernist style.
No, it's
the global.
It's the same arguments we rehearsed here in the 50s and 60s. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
But at the same time, I guess recycling is getting a bit of a comeback over here with kind of things like packing crates used for architecture and the Olympic Park, for example, the stuff which is coming out is going to be kind of recycled in future projects. Do you think there's anything different about it happening out of choice? I guess it's kind of like aesthetic, maybe even ethical kind of decision, as opposed to maybe cities where you were seeing it happening, where it's kind of born of need, I guess.
Yeah.
Is there something different that kind of produce different results? Is it any less interesting?
Well, I think they're both interesting, but interesting for very different reasons. So as you said, I mean, you almost summed it up perfectly yourself, that you have this one example where it's a necessity, and another example where it's quite topical and it's quite exciting to take things and remake them, and so I think they're both perhaps independent of each other, and there isn't perhaps that same crossover. Although I do wonder, for example, in some of these cities and examples where, as their economy continues to punch above its own weight, will people then become more disposable? And this kind of agency that has worked in some way, will that be lost or discarded? And so that's interesting to me, is what's the future for these places, and where will they be in 5 years and 10 years' time? Yeah, thanks.
There was one other thing. You're a fearless and intrepid researcher, because actually, in some cases, I can imagine you're arriving somewhere you've not been before.
Sure.
It's extremely difficult to make sense of it. Yeah. Stuff is happening 24/7. It doesn't have the, I don't really like the word coherence in some ways that we're used to, particularly in the way we think as architects. And yet you managed to engage with it and form these relationships with people. I thought the camera idea was absolutely brilliant, and I think the photographic results of it are extraordinary.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I'd always arrive and I'd always look for a map. I like plans, I'm an architect, and so I'd always ask everyone, where can I get this map from? And I'd spend the first 3 days looking for a map, and there's no map. And so in the end, that became, and it's a bit like the Excel, it's a bit like the spreadsheet, which I would initially sort of go through and try to contact people, but actually just by entering the city and by being open to the kinds of conversations I have, and relying on some kind of instinct that I could just get by. And I suppose the most pleasing aspect of this entire journey is that my MacBook Pro came home with me, the Nikon camera came home with me, the iPhone came home with me, and everyone's quite surprised by that, especially my father. And so some of these engagements must have worked quite well, yeah, I really had a good time, really enjoyed it.
Well, I believe the process of architectural education is to produce versatile problem solvers, and we have a fabulous example here, Thomas Aquilina.
Thanks so much.